Ja,
Früh.
ja, und der Vortrag ist natürlich jetzt nicht so Pflichtprogramm.
Ich glaube schon. Ich glaube, es sind einige, die sich einfach darauf ausreden, sie können das im Internet anschauen. Die Keynote kann man nachsehen. Aber es sind immerhin die. Schauen Sie, weil ich schon mal sitzt da.
Ah ja, da ist er.
Und vielleicht, warten Sie, muss man noch meine Stoffkarten und so holen, damit ich Ihnen das dann auch anzeigen kann und danach würde ich Sie anmoderieren.
Genau, Sie machen dann einfach.
Und kommen gleich. Es werden noch einige immer wieder so reinprobieren.
Ja, klar. Frühmorgens.
Genau.
Man schafft es einfach nicht so, wie man dachte.
Möglicherweise, genau. So, very good morning, everybody, and welcome to a second day of our conference. I'm very happy to see, although it's immediately early morning, many of you here, and welcome you to our Constance Holden Memorial Address that is going to be given by Jochen Paulus this year. Jochen Paulus is a German psychologist. He did his master's in Tübingen a couple of years back, and he's then decided to go into the journalistic profession. He's a freelance journalist that is publishing in different outlets, periodicals, in newspapers, amongst others the German version of Psychology Today, Die Zeit, Frankfurter Allgemeine, and so on, different renowned newspapers that you will probably not be as familiar with as English-speaking outlets, but which are widely disseminated in the German-speaking areas. And he does also radio and TV broadcasts amongst others, where he interviewed also members of our society, for instance, Aljoscha Neubauer or Rich Heyer, Lars Penke, amongst others. He received for his work, amongst others, the media prizes of the German Association for Psychology, the German Association for Psychiatry and Psychotherapy, Psychosomatics, and Nervenheilkunde. I looked it up in the dictionary. I don't know the English expression for Nervenheilkunde. I'm very sorry. Anyway, it's a great honor, and I'm very happy that he agreed on accepting our invitation and that he's going to deliver the Constance Holden Memorial Address now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So the honor is all mine. Good morning. I feel flattered that I've been invited to give this address in honor of the great science journalist Constance Holden. This is a congress about intelligence, but I'm sure it wouldn't be a wise idea to tell you, intelligence researchers, something about intelligence as a journalist. So I'll talk about something I know a little more about: journalism, more specifically science journalism, and even more specifically science journalism covering psychological science. You may wonder once in a while why journalists write what they write about your area of expertise, namely psychology. Well, I have a few ideas and a few stories to share. Let me start with an extreme example. We journalists love extreme examples. It's a case that I know well because I was involved. My involvement ultimately resulted in this article. I had noticed for years news items like these coming from a certain Institut für rationelle Psychologie. That means Institute for Efficient Psychology. I never found out why they picked that name. Maybe it's an inside joke, which would make sense, as we will see. News like these were published throughout the German press, local newspapers, yellow press, but sometimes even in quality media. In addition to that, the institute worked for big companies in Germany, allegedly hundreds. I called up a few. Some couldn't find out whether some department in their big company had hired the institute, but a few large ones confirmed: a chain of fashion stores, a chain of department stores, a brewery. The director of the institute was a certain Hannah Ertl, according to media, professor of neuropsychology. You should find traces of a professor in the literature. I didn't, with one interesting exception. More about that in a minute. Confronted, he said, he wasn't a real professor, but some institution he would not name had given him the title. You could find books by him for a lay audience. For instance, this one, Palm Reading Explained Easily. This was easy to find and should have raised red flags had journalists tried to find out something about Ertl. Most didn't, apparently. The institute supposedly sported a multidisciplinary research community. I couldn't find any track of that either. But it would indeed have needed much research power to do some of the research it claimed to have done. In one study, Ertl allegedly measured the courage coefficient of men in 60 cities, doing psychophysiological measurements with a few dozens of them in each city, while showing them dangerous situations. That would have been hundreds or thousands of men. According to the results, men of Cologne have a courage coefficient just short of heroism, whereas those of Vienna demonstrated very big cowardice. As the magazine put it, Ertl allegedly did the study for Surrey locals. The director of the institute... Now, it's almost impossible to disprove such studies as a journalist. Even if you had the means to run a replication, it would be hard, because there is no description what they did exactly or how that mysterious courage coefficient was defined. But in one of their studies, they used a well-known measure, the body mass index. Again, they compared citizens of different cities, the 50 biggest this time, and Crown Rostock, as Germany's fattest. Luckily, the Statistisches Bundesamt, Germany's office in charge of statistics, came out later, as usual, with a similar statistic. They had only data on the state level, but there are 3 German cities that are states as well. So I could compare the values for these with Ertl's, and they differed remarkably. More than 2 BMI points in the case of Hamburg. That's a bigger difference than that between the most and the least fat state in the official statistic. Inhabitants of different cities are simply not that different. I suspect that would be true for many of these comparisons if they were done correctly. Ertl didn't respond when I asked him about that difference to the official statistic. So, there are a lot of reasons for doubt, but that didn't stop journalists reporting his findings again and again and again. But it must be said, they were not the only ones who published the highly suspect results of that institute. The institute allegedly did a very big study. The authors claimed that they had surveyed almost 6,000 Germans and had given them pornographic measures to 2,300 German women and men, and had done psychophysiological measurements with them up to 24 weeks. That would have been an incredibly expensive study. Could you find that kind of money for your research? I asked Ertl where the money came from, and he said Beate was very generous. Beate Uhse ran a well-known company in Germany selling sex toys and stuff like that. I asked the company, and indeed, they had given some money, but only a small amount. So, there were reasons enough to have serious doubts about that institute, and yet it got published by a respected about that study, and yet it got published by a respected publishing house in a series edited by leading professors, if I remember correctly. The book, again, was quoted in the Brockhaus, the leading German encyclopedia, something like our Encyclopedia Britannica. But this is, of course, no excuse for all the journalists who ran these stories and took the results at face value. I have to confess I was one of them long before I wrote the piece I'm talking about. I wrote a long story about the effects of pornography for a regional newspaper and was pretty proud that I had checked out some scientific books out of the university library and had based my reporting partly on them. That is not standard for regional newspapers. Unfortunately, one of the books was this. I was only an apprentice at the newspaper, but I had a diploma in psychology, so I should have become suspicious. My article put an end to that nonsense, but only after this had been going on for more than a dozen of years. Hannah Erdl denied anything, even the fact that his institute was based in Stuttgart, as I had written. He did so under the letterhead of his institute, with a Stuttgart address. He claimed that he had sued me, but never did. He probably knew why. The editor-in-chief of a news agency that had run these stories wrote an email to his crew, remarking these studies seem to have been more or less completely faked, but they concerned mostly sex, nice or quirky cliches, so heads at most media were turned off. And after all, you have to ask, how was that study done, if it lands on your table? Very good comments, if somewhat late. So, why did journalists run these stories all those years? One obvious answer is right there. Journalists liked the results of the studies because they thought, probably correctly, that their readers would like them. There were lots of sex, interesting stuff to read with a chuckle and to talk about. I mean, Men of Cologne, all heroes, and those of Vienna, cowards. Isn't it interesting? But there are deeper reasons why journalists get psychology wrong. To be sure, most journalists rarely get it that wrong. Most of the coverage is correct, at least in a technical sense. The experts actually did say what is claimed, at least in a way. But the coverage can still be grossly misleading. I'll give you other examples, but let's go first to the reasons I suspect behind the wrong decisions. When I learned the journalistic trade decades ago, I was sent to a 4-week seminar. One evening we had a guest, a writer of books, who also worked for a classy magazine model after National Geographic. He told us that how he as a successful author worked. So he would travel some foreign land and would come back to write his piece. That he would not do in Wuppertal or some other rainy German city, but he would rent a romantic flat in Tuscany to go at work. Maybe my memory embellishes the scene a little, but not too much. He was paid so well, he bragged. I doubt that the pay over there is so well still. I worked for a sister publication and didn't make it to Tuscany. But surely most authors are not paid so well. Writing in Germany has never been a financially rewarding profession, as you can see on the classical painting on the right. Let's take a modern example. You do a 5-minute radio piece for a large public radio station. That earns you about 350 euros. How long can you work for that if you want to earn the average German income? This is what freelance writers typically get, according to studies. And most science writers have an academic degree and some kind of education in their trade. So you are certainly not overpaid if you get an average income. You can work about a day and a half for that kind of money. What do you have to do in that time? First, keep yourself informed, even to be able to come up with a proposal for a journalistic piece. I spend a good deal of my time not on any piece, but reading news releases and browsing through journals. Don't try to read this list. It's more to impress you. I once met a guy I studied psychology with at a congress. He had become a psychology professor. We talked a little bit about what we were doing. It turned out that I spent far more time reading journals than he could afford with all those meetings, bureaucracy, and so forth. Can I afford it? Not really. And I have cut back that time considerably since. So, a good part of that day and a half is already gone before you have done anything for a specific piece. And the remaining day, you have to do these things. Convince an editor that she or he should commission the piece, find more literature, read it partly, find at least one expert, interview her or him, transcribe the interview, choose the segments you want to use, find the segment in the sound file, cut them out, cut all the airs, cut all the half sentences with words nobody would understand, write the manuscript, send it to the editor, make the corrections the editor wants, send it back, send the sound files. Now, you can't really shorten most of these tasks, but you can read less and you can not even try to find the best expert. Just take the one who is always asked and gives bold quotes, as you know from the press archive. It's really win-win. Most likely he'll deliver. And if it turns out that he's not really reliable, well, everybody quoted him, so they can't fire you. Therefore, we have experts who are always in the media, like him. Professor Manfred Spitzer. He was and is a professor of psychiatry in Ulm, medical director of the psychiatric clinic of the university there, had 5 kids or so, but still found the time to write best-selling books. They sport bold ideas as what brain size can tell you about how to teach in school. For instance, you can prove with brain size that you shouldn't have religion at the curriculum. The brain of the children is not ready yet, you see. I took him to task for claims like these in Germany's leading weekly newspaper. I achieved exactly nothing, except that he was offered a rebuttal much longer than the few paragraphs I had written about his ideas. Spitzer went on writing books like Digital Dementia, How We Make Us and Our Children Lose Our Minds. Of course, journalists love to quote and interview him. That way, they save time. I did too, in a way, when I wrote the piece. I planned to cite Elsbeth Stern, who is also here, with a quote I had found in an article or book of hers. I hesitated because I wasn't quite sure if I wasn't quoting her out of context. I could have asked her, but that would have cost time, and if she said no, I don't mean it that way, I would have to find another expert witness. In the end, I decided it's okay. I was lucky. 2 years later, I got this mail from her. So, I was lucky this time and unwittingly even started her deserved career as an expert in that debate. But, of course, it's a lot more efficient not to read texts from many experts or to call them, trying to find out who is right to what degree. Just ask one. It makes the story a lot simpler because there are no contradictions and it reduces your workload incredibly. In a very brief stint as an editor, I had to edit a manuscript of a colleague. It was a good text, but I had a few not very exotic questions. I called her up and asked them. She couldn't answer a single one, if I remember it correctly. Apparently, she had just asked 2 experts what she wanted to cover in her 1,600 words article, and that was that. I admire this kind of efficiency. She is now a science editor at one of our leading newspapers. So, in the end, often everything depends on the one expert or the few experts a journalist asks. But who are they? I tried to find out and chose, surprise, intelligence researchers as an example. Here's my pseudoscientific study. I first made a list of intelligence researchers journalists might quote. The German Wikipedia has a list of people categorized under intelligence researchers. I put these on my list. I entered the keyword intelligence in APA ScicNet and chose the 10 researchers with the most publications in peer-reviewed journals in this century. And I consulted the list of @DINA of eminent psychologists and selected the intelligence researchers I recognized as such. Of course, I have a section with the limitations, lots of serious ones, but who cares? Certainly not a journalist. Here's the list I ended up with. The red ones had the most publications about intelligence in ScicNet. The bold ones are on the list by DINA et al. And the rest is Wikipedia only. Sorry if I forgot you despite your importance. This was my best shot. Blame my sources. Most names won't surprise you much. Some may. Then I went to a database of German press articles and did a search for each person on my list, combined with the search term intelligence. The database contains articles from the German press, daily newspapers, weekly newspapers, magazines. It goes back decades. I checked in how many articles each of the experts on my list were featured. So we find half of the researchers with the most articles in peer-reviewed journals, 5 out of 10, were never mentioned at all. 2 more taken together scored only 4 appearances in all these media over all these years. Some of the eminent intelligence researchers do not fare much better. So, who are the researchers that are relied upon a lot? To create suspense, I'll withhold the name of the winner for a moment. You can see a few things. The German press sure honors the old William Stern, Hans-Jürgen Eysenck, Charles Bierman, Thomas Bouchard, David Wexler. It pays to be controversial. Arthur Janssen, Hans-Jürgen Eysenck, Richard Bernstein, Richard Lynn. The Flynn effect got a lot of coverage. That won't surprise you. Detlef Rost is an educational psychology. He did a very fine long-term study comparing gifted and not so gifted children. I'll come back to Howard Gardner and Robert Sternberg in a minute. Let's first look at the winner, Siegfried Lehrl. Many of you probably never heard of him. He's a psychologist born 1943, so he's 79, but he's mentioned regularly, at least until recently. He held many job positions, is the author of more than one intelligence test. He claims 450 scientific publications. I found 50 publications in PsycInfo and in the German equivalent PubPsych. I wonder where the rest is. He has published books with titles like 5 IQ points more in 7 days. Apparently you can achieve this by eating the right food. He also claimed that chewing gum helps your cognitive abilities along. Detlef Rost doubted that and actually did a series of studies. He found almost no beneficial effects. Siegfried Lehrl also publishes exercises to train the brain. You get the idea of what media love, or many of them anyway. And on my list were only intelligence researchers. There are also, of course, trainers, coaches, and other experts waiting to be interviewed. So, the articles featuring our winner may not tell you all that much about intelligence research. But let's look at the rest of the list. Apart from the historical and/or controversial figures, there are a few interesting names. Robert Blauman is a special case, mainly doing behavioral genetics that may or may not involve intelligence. Same with Thomas Bouchard. Ian Deary is, as far as I can see, a mainstream intelligence researcher. You ask or read him, and you will more or less get what most intelligence researchers would say. That is not the case with Howard Gardner and Robert Sternberg. Gardner, of course, stands for the idea of multiple intelligences that is not generally acknowledged. But you wouldn't know from at least some of the articles about him and his work. And then there's Robert Sternberg. When I ran the search for Sternberg, the headline of the article on the right caught my eye. High IQ equals pointless. I wrestled with myself and decided to pay the €2.89 they were asking for the article. It was worth the money. The text starts with this paragraph. This is an article from the local paper Neue Presse Coburg, a small city in Bavaria. It's meant as a humorous piece, but the facts should still be true. The article gives the impression that it is quoting Sternberg verbatim. I don't know, of course, whether Sternberg actually put it that way, but he certainly belittles the role of G, ridicules IQ tests. For the quote on the left, I can vouch. It's from an interview with me in 2008. I doubt that he would repeat that in a scholarly journal, and he stepped back a little when I challenged him, but I'm most likely not the only journalist whom he told things like this. You can also find them in his popular book, Successful Intelligence. Now, as a journalist, you could have the hunch that that might not be the general consensus among psychologists. IQ tests are widely used, after all. Then again, Robert Sternberg sports a really impressive biography, as you know. So, it's tempting for a journalist to throw caution to the wind and go with the headline he offers you. If it turns out to be nonsense, you can always say, well, look at his credentials. The problem with Sternberg's remark about highly gifted people is that it feeds right into a popular meme many people, including journalists, believe. Highly gifted people have all kinds of problems. You see so many headlines like these that my hunch is that journalists get the facts more often wrong than right when it comes to high intelligence. To a large part, so-called experts are to blame. They work in counseling centers for gifted people. Of course, the gifted people who go there have problems, whilst would they go? P.S. The issue seems to be more controversial than I thought when I wrote that part of the presentation, as we have heard yesterday. But on the other hand, the example proves my larger point. It is anything but easy to get psychology right. Researchers, as I have said, have a huge influence on what media report. This is one of my all-time favorites. The example is not about intelligence research, but from personality psychology. Most of you will be at home there, who can make a living out of intelligence research alone. The interesting part goes like this. Burkhard Andresen, a psychologist from Hamburg, developed a model of the risk personality, and with that he, quote, shattered a classical theory of personality psychology, namely, unquote, namely the Big Five. How did he do that? He found a sixth factor, readiness to risk and fight. Now, as we all know, all kinds of researchers have found a sixth or a seventh basic factor of personality. Different ones, of course, but the Big Five are still standing tall, whereas none of all the additional factors can rival the Big Five to this day. I haven't heard from the readiness to risk and fight factor in a long time. So, who gave the author the idea that the Big Five would be replaced by the Big Six, including this factor? I don't know. All we know is that we also talked to Burkhard Andresen. Why him? We don't know that either, but it might have been kind of natural. They are both based in Hamburg. I don't want to criticize Burkhard Andresen or his risk personality. The problem is the journalist telling an unwitting readership, by the way, that the central model of personality psychology is tumbling down. Whether Andresen put it that way or the journalist misunderstood him, I don't know. The example shows two things. Experts as I said repeatedly, are extremely important for psychology reporting because most journalists covering psychological topics have not much expertise themselves. Specialized and large media tend to have psychologists in their team, or at least people who know a lot about the field. But otherwise, the general conviction is that every journalist can write about psychology. We are all human, after all, aren't we? They would never allow me to write about soccer, and rightly so. The other way around, I'm not so sure. Often that works well, as long as you stumble upon the right expert. A few years ago, I was hired as a kind of consultant for a TV crew preparing a program about intelligence. They were all fine science journalists, probably among the best in German TV, but none of them was a psychologist. They would cover squeaking frogs this month, a space mission next, and the future of nuclear power after that also. More about that consulting experience in a minute, but here are two questions I was asked. Would that intelligence test I found on the web be a good intelligence test to show? Hard to tell. There are no reliabilities and no validities given. But here's a hint. The site features horoscopes too. Other question, who is a good intelligence expert? Aljoscha Neubauer? Thumbs up. Siegfried Lell? Well. You may know this quote. You may even know who said it or wrote it, except that you don't, because it's ascribed to many authors, amongst them the usual suspects like Mark Twain. According to one guy on the internet who tried to find the real author, nobody really knows. So the quote kind of proves itself. You probably know the studies that psychologists, at least in the US, are mostly liberals, and the claim that this influences the research questions they ask and maybe even the answers they find. I don't have recent data, but I'm sure it's the same with journalists here, at least at most quality media. And that, of course, influences what they read, what parts of it they believe, and what they remember in the end. So, journalists know a lot of things when it comes to intelligence, not all of them true. Some of those claims came up when I tried to help out the TV colleagues. Of course, the question came up, are there IQ differences between races or ethnic groups? Most people I know would answer, of course not, and it would be racist even to consider that possibility. I hope they are right, but I answered with a great quote by Earl Hunt. This sentence, you can read, was already in the script for the program. Today we know the size of the brain tells you nothing about the intellectual abilities of a person. The sentence followed an introduction about what researchers used to believe in the old days of Paul Broca. Of course, we know better, don't we? I doubt that the colleague even bothered to research the question. It seems so obvious that simple claims like this just can't be true. Besides, that would mean that the size of your brain determines your intellectual abilities, and nothing can be done about it. That would be deeply unfair, and so it's hard to believe for a liberal journalist. The conclusion is not quite right. Of course, the environment matters a great deal. When I got the script to look over it, I answered with a list of quotes from the sources given above. Skip this for time reasons. Obviously, this address must end with a few ideas concerning what could be done. It's easy to come up with advice how journalists could do a much better job. Of course, they could do more research, but they don't have the time. Of course, they should ask themselves, do I really know that? Or would I just like it to be true? But we all know how hard it is to question your convictions. Of course, journalists could seek out more reliable experts, but how should they find them? How would they know who they are? I shall come back to that point in a minute, though. And of course, journalists shouldn't just jump on every study just because the results are so sexy, as scientists themselves like to put it. One of the best science writers we got has an idea concerning this point. Journalists should report only on meta-analysis and literature reviews. I adore the work of Steven Pinker, and of course it's a good idea. And of course this is not going to happen. There's the word jure in the name of our profession, not decade, which seems to be more or less the time scientists need to sort things out. It's really old news by then. At least one press release knew it all along. There's an additional problem. Even meta-analysis don't guarantee reliable reporting. There are examples from the long-standing debate whether violent computer games make their users aggressive. The topic is a journalistic nightmare. Scholars are heavily divided, as you probably know. I'll shorten this a little bit, but as you know, well, one side, for instance, that task force say they do make you aggressive to some degree, and the other says no, it's not true at all. And both sides quote meta-analysis to prove their point. So what should I, as a journalist, do with contradictory statements like this? Do a she said, he said piece? The audience is not really interested in the debates of scholars. It wants to know how things are. After all, there are your kids in their room firing away before a screen. What to do with them? So, what could scientists do? Scientists could provide concise, easy-to-access information. The famous report by the task force headed by Ulrich Neisser of 1996 was a fine example. Most of it is probably still true, but a journalist can't rely on a 26-year-old paper. I've seen, of course, that Jakub Piecznik will present the results of a similar endeavor right after my talk, an online survey about what intelligence researchers agree upon or not. Maybe this could be the basis of a report similar to that of Neisser and his crew back then. There should be an easy way to find a lay version of knowledge summaries like these online. Of course, if you put basic information only, for instance, on the website of ISIR, not many journalists will find it. There should be at least a link in the web link sections of Wikipedia. The ISIR website is already referenced, and there are interviews with leading experts, but most journalists don't have the time to watch these. You might want to have a list of trusted experts willing to talk to journalists, organized by country. Pick experts able to make themselves understood in lay terms. Now, of course, journalists will still get psychology wrong sometimes, whatever you do, but perhaps you could make it harder for them. I know from long years of personal experience that psychology researchers are very willing to help journalists to get it right. Many intelligence experts donated a lot of their time to do interviews with me without getting anything in return. And my interviews easily last an hour. Thanks to them all, and thank you for listening to my talk. So. The microphones are coming.
So thank you so much for your talk, and we've got already a question.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, because yesterday we had problems. Yeah, thank you for this wonderful talk. I think the biggest problem is that when things are wrong in psychology, they don't come from psychology, or at least not from scientists in psychology themselves. Siegfried Lerl never has been a professor of psychology. He had another position, so he could really spread his nonsense. The same was with Spitzer, who is a psychiatrist, and he should really deal with children who have real problems with their brain and not with normal school children. But for some reasons, a lot of, sometimes even professors from other disciplines think they can say about psychology everything they just think about. And I think this is the problem, that journalists often ask not the experts in the field. This was also the case during the pandemic. Experts on viruses had to answer questions on epidemiology. Of course they couldn't, but they did it all the time, and so a lot of wrong things came around. But the question is why? I don't know what motives people have from other disciplines to talk about their about topics outside of their field of expertise, but it's a very strong thing, as we know from Spitzer and all these things. Therefore, I think journalists should learn more about expertise, the fields of expertise, and then probably they would get to the right people.
Yeah, I quite agree. But of course, it must be said there are psychology professors like Robert Sternberg who say questionable things why shouldn't a journalist who knows nothing about the question in question quote him? I showed you his impressive biography. Speak up a little bit, but I can basically hear you.
Okay. As you notice, psychologists cannot operate microphones, so our capacities to do things are somewhat limited. I was going to call to your attention, thank you very much for your talk. I realize that journalists are in a rush, and so are psychologists, and they are not really rewarded for talking to journalists. Wikipedia is a battleground, and it's actually controlled by the person who's most willing to edit it again and again and again. So psychologists have great difficulty there. They cannot spend their time correcting things. It's just not something they can do, and it's not reliable on many things in intelligence. Now, I'd like to turn the focus not on journalists, but on psychologists. I think there are things we can do better. So what I'd like you to say is, the psychologists who've helped you most, what behaviors have they followed which we should imitate so that we can best communicate with sympathetic and inquisitive journalists?
So it's a great talk. It feels like one thing that journalists are specializing in uncovering new truths and interesting stories for the public. And it feels then like the thing that journalists could write would be a story about how I was misled by an academic. And in other words, if you cast it in terms of incentives, the incentive for the person who claims to have completely overturned 100 years of personality research is to have an article written about him saying how, on the basis of one study, which we know is foolish, he completely wasted thousands of hours of people's time, and actually write that article. It's the job of the journalist to say, these universities are full of liars. Many of these people are pushing political biases. And I think people would love those stories. They're very human, right? You're catching someone in the act. Is that possible, or what's the disincentive for a journalist to do that?
Could you repeat that question in one sentence, maybe, and hold the microphone a little closer?
So if you can hear me, so journalists uncover the truth, and when they're misled, that's a new truth. What's to stop a journalist from writing a story, how my university professor lied to me?
Well, frankly, I don't have a spontaneous idea what journalists could do. Yeah, you're referring to that Institute of Rationelle Psychologie I started with? Yeah. Well, as I said, they liked the headlines. They could print and never bother to dig deeper. It has to be said, when my article came out, it was written about by other media. So Spiegel Online is an example, and that psychology professor even went so far to go to the prosecuting agency to ask them to inquire in that suspected wrongly well, that guy presenting the title of a professor he probably never had. Well, it went back and forth. In the end, nothing happened. But there were reactions.
You wonder why Sternberg say wrong things. You know, populism is part of modern culture. There are psychologists and biologists and so on, but most probably in psychology, people want to be popular. So they say wrong things. We know in psychology that Gartner was wrong. There are no multiple intelligences. Sternberg was wrong in many things that he talked about. So if you ask, how can we deal with this problem? I don't think that we can face populism because it's part of the modern culture. So institutions such as, for example, the academies of sciences, or even serious universities themselves, because there are universities which are not serious either, have to have institutions for promoting, let's say, scientific literacy and understanding of the functioning of science, and understanding that science can be wrong. It's not always necessarily correct in what is discovered. I think that universities and our societies actually function as they used to be functioning at the beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th century. This is over, and scientific literacy has to be targeted specifically through institutions and obviously through education, from very early, from primary education on. In as long this does not happen, we will have the phenomena that you described very nicely.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have a question about the journalistic landscape in Germany, because I think it was 2 weeks back when a talk at the Humboldt-Universität was cancelled that was about sexes. And I was wondering if this has always been the case in Germany, or if the overturned window is actually closing, that you're not allowed to talk about so many things anymore. Has this always been the case? I mean, you had the example of race and IQ, which you obviously can't talk about anymore, but also some very basic things you're not allowed to talk about anymore. So if you work for a newspaper, in my opinion, your editor-in-chief should shield you from all these guys. This doesn't seem to happen anymore. They just backstab their own journalists. Could you comment on that? Because I do not really get it.
Yeah, it depends on the specific medium you're talking about, of course, but I think, no, there aren't things you can't talk about as long as they are not openly racist or so. But I was asked this yesterday, can you write that intelligence is heritable to a large amount? And yes, I can, and I did so. Often. So I think there are no taboos as long as you stay with science.
Well, thanks a lot also from my side for your talk. So I would like to propose an hypothesis on why journalism goes wrong so often, and I would be interested in whether you think this is whether this is correct, whether this is like in alignment with your views. So as someone whose first degree was in political science at this university, my impression was that most journalists who tend to be graduates of my field have absolutely no clue of statistics or methodological or mathematical knowledge. About a year ago, I was working at Der Tagesspiegel at the Data Science Institute, and I was really shocked to see that even at this subsection, people who were supposed to write about data and about science had usually absolutely no clue about data, statistics, or science. Like most people who ended up working there had degrees in German studies, in literature, or these kind of fields. So my question would be, are there any standards in journalism when it comes to making hiring decisions on like scientific knowledge, in your impression?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, sure. So my question was whether there are any standards when it comes to a specific skill set that journalists need to have when they should write about science.
Well, no formal ones. So editors hire journalists, they have the feeling that they will get things correctly, that they know things about them. But, well, it's kind of luck what happens next. So you talked about the role of statistical knowledge, if I understood you correctly. Well, there is this new trend of data journalism, meaning that journalists do try to get large amounts of data and do run their own statistics. Yeah, it's an interesting idea, but I think you really have to know a lot about statistics to get that right. So I hope they do. What I would like to see is that journalists, science journalists, at least have a basic understanding of how you do a proper study, that you have to have a control group which is really comparable and things like that. And you should not confuse correlation with causality and things like that. I gave a talk to colleagues about questions like these, and it was really a quick and dirty guide. You can't go into details, and I myself, even though I am a psychologist, could never tell if that factor analysis was done correctly or not. I can check simple things.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's an interesting topic. Just a comment. I do not share the pessimism that is going around like a disease at the moment generally, because I think if you look at the past, I wasn't around in the 1970s, but first of all, I think the situation has greatly improved, although a lot of people say you can't say certain things nowadays. I think the democratic culture, especially in Western Europe, has greatly improved. Of course, it's always a way of the way you say things, and if you act, because people very quickly pick up on agendas that people have. And so that plays into that. But the second thing is that I think responsibility has to, I'm a very deterministic person myself, and I know that information is important, but one thing I think is that the responsibility should, to a certain degree, be given back to the public. Because a very prominent example in Germany, I don't like to call names, but we have a scientist in Germany called Gerald Hütter, who is very, very prominent in the popular media, who's published books not just on intelligence, but also on the topic of attention deficit disorder. And he basically states that if you take these little boys that are just misunderstood by society and you just let them take a nice hike up in the Alps somewhere, then magically, poof, these problems are just going to disappear. And it's not like we don't have alternative literature. We live in a day and age where we have so much information at our disposal. My father, when he was at university, he had to go to the library to learn the stuff he learned. And today, you just one click, if you have proper internet connection, you get information ad libitum. So it's a responsibility thing, because most people still tend to favor books by Gerald Hütter over other authors, because it's just very, very hard to get rid of the lay person's intuition. And even if that's completely wrong, you can never convince a person. I've tried it myself very often to convince people that vocabulary is a good measure of intelligence. It just won't happen. People don't buy into it. You can give them all the studies you want, you can show them all the statistics you like. Vocabulary is a measure of class, it's a measure of how often do parents talk to their children, and that's it, end of story. And if you don't like it, then... So I think it's, you can share that pessimism, you can say, oh, it's horrible, what can we do? How can journalists, improve? But I think we always will have to live. I mean, there's a reason why in astrophysics, you rarely hear people on the streets having heated debates on the nature of black holes, right? I've never heard that before. Street workers talk about how large the universe is, right? It doesn't happen. But people talk about intelligence even if they have no background. So I think we will have to always live with a certain degree of ignorance. And I don't even think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually agree with this view, because you mentioned the conflicts and the uninviting at the Humboldt University, and this is exactly the case that we talked about previously, because they didn't invite an expert on the field of gender and sex. They invited ocean biologists to talk about this, which is really like they invited someone who's not an expert on the field, and they realized this. And of course there was a lot of controversy because it's a controversial topic, but I think it's actually a very good sign that they reevaluated if they really want to invite this person whose talk might have an impact on people's lives, because she's not an expert on the topic. So I actually also am optimistic that things are getting better.
Are there any more questions? Well, if not, then thank you so much for your nice talk. We will have now a coffee break to get everyone's circulation going, and at 10:40 we will resume with our first session of the day.
Hallöchen.
Hi.
Englisch.